Marcel Khalife here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue our conversation with the pair of Canadians who were recently released from an Egyptian prison after spending nearly 2 months detained. They'd rushed to the scene of a massacre in August to treat wounded protesters and film what was taking place when they were arrested. John Greyson, a Canadian filmmaker, member of Queers Against Israeli Apartheid; Tarek Loubani, emergency room medical doctor, assistant professor at Western University in London, Ontario, a Palestinian refugee, one of the architects of the Canada-Gaza academic collaboration that brings doctors from the West to Gaza to train physicians. So talk about being in jail, Tarek, and when you decided to go on a hunger strike.
Well, the entire process in jail was very much about controlling and dominating us. And this, of course, happened physically just by virtue of our captivity, but it also happened psychologically. So, for example, we never felt like we had any input into the judicial process. We were actually never interrogated by the prosecutor's office about what we had seen or what we were doing. We really felt that we were voiceless. And so John, myself, and actually the rest of the prisoners in our first room had these discussions about how it was that we could take back a little bit of control or assert ourselves to speak with the world around us. And we realized ultimately that there was no way to do this. Our messages were not getting out. We were not able to even communicate with our lawyers effectively or at all. Our first meeting was only the last day before we were released. And so we finally decided to go on hunger strike. And the value of hunger strike is one that I think every 2-year-old understands. I mean, when you have no other power, you always have the ability to hunger strike.
And John Greyson, what was the reaction of your fellow inmates, not only to the hunger strike, but just to the reality of having 2 Canadians jailed with them at the same time?
When we were brought into the prison with the welcoming party, all the other prisoners witnessed this beating of the Canada and the Palestinian. So there was already a huge amount of solidarity and support for us. And really the other 36 in the first cell went out of their way to take care of us. They were, always giving us the last piece of food, the last tomato, etc. There was incredible caring and real concern for us, and also real interest in the work we were trying to do in solidarity with Gaza. That said, when we discussed hunger strike, the fellow prisoners were really split in terms of their advice. They said, watch out, it's very dangerous, the prison will throw you in solitary. So there was a lot of strategizing and getting good advice from them about how to proceed. We decided to do a liquids-only hunger strike and not do it through the official prison channels. So it would have maximum impact in terms of outreach to the world and make the statement we wanted it to make. But we really didn't want to subject ourselves to the extreme situation of solitary.
John, were you concerned about the authorities finding out that you were gay?
Of course. We'd already been accused of being Hamas agents, of being Mossad agents, to, on top of that, be gay agents out to corrupt Egyptians, the good people of Egypt, was a very genuine fear. At the same time, it's a Google away. It's the easiest thing to find out about me. I've ironically made 3 films about prison, gay love stories about love and about life in prison. So it's also ironic that I made the films and then did my research just recently. I'd never spent a night in jail before this experience. But at the same time, I think people who overstress that issue tend to go towards a set of assumptions and prejudices around Arabic culture and Islamic culture, saying, oh, it's the West assumes, oh, it's overwhelmingly homophobic. I actually think it's much more complicated and nuanced, and it's about, are you forcing in the Western way a coming out agenda onto people, or are you being a person that they get to know and then it becomes part of what they discuss or don't discuss? In our particular case, it didn't come out to our fellow prisoners didn't find out, the guards didn't find out. So it remains an unanswered question. But it certainly was there as a concern.
John
and
Greyson.
The other irony was that Tarek and I were very interested in going to that larger prison called Gaza to continue conversations about LGBT issues on the ground in Gaza. I work with Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, who works with Queers in Palestine, Queers in the West Bank, on a bunch of boycott, divestment, sanctions actions and projects. But that conversation in Gaza is still at a different stage. So we were hoping that would be the work we were going to be doing. That's been postponed, but hopefully sometime in the future.
And John Greyson, the Egyptian authorities claimed that at one point that they found some drone-like surveillance equipment in your hotel. Could you talk about that?
Tarek can probably speak best to what were 2 quadcopters used for medical testing.
Tarek, could you talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the context here is that anybody who knows me knows that I'm a geek, and I very much enjoy sort of playing with new technologies and trying to bring these new technologies into applications into which they weren't necessarily designed. After having read and seen lots of good work that happened in South Africa using the same technology, which basically uses GPS-guided aerial vehicles, like basically little planes with GPS computer on them, to take stuff from one place to the other, I'd been thinking about the same thing, both in London, Ontario, where I work, and in the Gaza Strip, where the distances aren't very large, but the terrain can be very brutal. So getting from one hospital to another, both in London and in Gaza, is a remarkably difficult task. And there's centralization in Gaza especially of lots of the testing. So to get it effectively done, you'd have to put it in a taxi, and 3 hours later it might show up at the place where it needed to be. Our goal really with this technology was then to try to experiment with ways of transporting things or ways of moving things. The interesting thing about it is that this technology is available off the shelf in downtown Cairo. And the Egyptians themselves, even though we were worried, didn't really make a big deal out of it. They were much more worried about John's footage. And having reviewed the YouTube videos available, I can see why. His footage was probably the best footage of that day. Instead, it ended up being sort of a cudgel that was used in Canada by a couple of the right-wing commentators here as an attempt to plant us as spies or, I don't know, Hamas agents or something, as though, you know, a Canadian doctor and his, like, a gay filmmaker friend who were both going to Gaza were really the best vehicle for smuggling instead of the tunnels that bring in thousands of rockets. So really it was never an issue. It was just like taking in any other medical equipment. However, because of lots of the what was going on ideologically, ended up being used in the Western media here, in Canada especially.
So John's film is confiscated, though we're able to show other footage of that day because there were a number of cameras there. But Tarek, if you could talk about the reaction to you as a Canadian Palestinian, what was the authorities and the other prisoners' reaction, and then talk about your father coming to Cairo to try to get you both released.
Well, in terms of being a Palestinian going through Egypt over the last few years has been a variable experience. And so sometimes when the propaganda was sort of pro-Palestinian, it would be a very comfortable experience, and many other times it would be uncomfortable, to say the least. And this is the experience really of all Palestinians traveling through Egypt. Mine, of course, is mitigated by the fact that I speak English fluently and that I carry a Canadian passport. John and I always sort of said that, like, we had these two coming out processes, the two closets, you know, John as a gay person and me as a Palestinian. And I really chose, and I found it really important in my case, to talk about being a Palestinian. And that was a very, very costly decision. It was quite costly. In fact, it was one of the main triggers that we got arrested. My Palestinian accent did me in, and when I was asked if I was Palestinian, I confirmed it, and that was the moment at which we were kind of physically arrested and brought into the station. The odds are, if I would have told them, no, I'm a Canadian, that would have been the end of that conversation. So being a Palestinian in jail was not very easy. Being a Palestinian in Egypt was, of course, not very easy, but I thought at least it was important for me to hold on to that part of my identity. In terms of my father coming, you know, my father, of course, like any parent, was sort of burning up on the inside, wondering what he could do and feeling helpless, and ultimately decided that he would come after the 45-day renewal. The 45-day renewal, we'd basically been in for 45 days and were renewed, unbeknownst to us at the time, for another 45 days. And it really represented the Egyptian government thumbing its nose at the international community and at really any semblance of a just or proper judicial process. So at that point, my father came to see what he could do, and his intention was to raise the media flags in Egypt and start talking about the issue and try to humanize John and I. He was ultimately able to do that. It was a big surprise to us when we saw him. And it coincided with the Egyptian government sort of starting to realize that they had an international problem on their hands. He was able to speak directly to the entire cabinet and pitch our case, you know, say who we were as people and as human beings. And, you know, the extent and the impact was there, though it's unclear sort of how influential that was. It is clear that in concert with everything else, it was definitely a contributor. We only have a minute. Which is great. I mean, I think every father wants to be the hero.
We only have 2 minutes to go, so very quickly, if you could tell us what's happened to the men who remain in prison and what role the Canadian government played. I mean, there were supporters and activists in Canada and throughout the world who were pushing for both of your release.
We got up because of extraordinary pressure mobilized by an incredible grassroots coalition. You know, everybody from the Prime Minister, our right-wing Prime Minister Stephen Harper, to kids' drawings, 6-year-old kids making drawings and getting them out there. We feel everybody's efforts made the difference and made the difference together. It's important to thank our Canadian government for the work they did. It's also important to emphasize that we were convenient for them. We were a way of them to be seen to be doing something about Egypt without actually ever criticizing the coup. So we're grateful and we're critical. With our fellow prisoners, the 600 remain in jail. They're up for, they hit the 90-day mark on November 11th, and we'll see if they get renewed or released. Every time we've tried to look in the crystal ball and predict, we've been proven wrong. So I don't know, Tarek, if you have any insight.
Tarek, final comments in these last seconds we have.
I mean, I think that these 600 people are going to get renewed because right now there isn't the international pressure to get them out. This is not a fair judicial process. This is very much a political witch hunt against essentially people with beards. So we have to apply pressure to the government to release them. I'm not saying charge them because as far as I can tell, there's no evidence against them. They should be released.
We want to thank you both for being with us, and we are so glad you are free. We will continue to follow the story of what is taking place in Egypt. Tarek Loubani is a doctor and professor at Western University in London, Ontario, where he's speaking to us from, and John Greyson, filmmaker, member of Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. They were imprisoned by the Egyptian regime for 50 days and ultimately released. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Mate, Nermin Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Al-Khafani, Masoud Rabi, Karen D.